Hello students, and welcome to lecture 13 of our series on human biology. And today we're going to be discussing the endocrine system. Endocrine system refers to the organs that produce hormones. Hormones are signals that are sent around the body. Those hormones are either produced from cholesterol, and when you create a hormone by modifying cholesterol, it is referred to as a steroid hormone. But there are other types of hormones that are made of short proteins, and we call those peptide hormones, or modified single amino acids. So we just call those amino acid hormones. So hormones are signals that are intracellular signals that are produced in many cases by organs that we classify as being part of the endocrine system. These organs are usually glands, so they produce the hormones and then secrete them out into the fluids of the body or the blood, and so these glands are referred to as endocrine glands. And the hormones will travel to other parts of the body and then send signals to other cells in the body telling them to do something, to either turn on genes or shut off genes or differentiate into another type of cell or to divide. So the endocrine system is kind of like a big messenger system where the signals are sent out to the body and the body undergoes changes as a result of hormones. Probably the most easy example to understand of this is when you get scared. Let's say your little brother puts on a monster mask and sneaks up behind you and then scares you. You turn around, you realize that it's just your little brother in a monster mask, but you're scared. Physically you're scared, even though mentally you know that it's nothing really to be scared about. But your body has become scared for a moment. You had no control over that. It was an automatic response. And the effects of that are that your heart is beating fast, and you're breathing fast, and you have a sensation of fear. You feel scared. And that happened because some little glands that sit on top of the kidneys, which are called the adrenal glands, have produced, in response to that stimulus, the scary stimulus, those glands have produced a hormone called adrenaline, which is technically called epinephrine. So the adrenal glands, and specifically a specific part of the adrenal gland, actually produces the hormone adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, and it causes these changes in your body. It causes your heart to beat faster, and it actually causes the capillaries in your skin to divert blood away from the skin so that your skin literally turns cold, because you have capillaries just underneath your skin which are meant to warm the surface of the body. If you're scared and your body thinks that you're either going to have to fight or run away to survive, it suddenly makes the decision that it's not really necessary to heat the outside of your skin. The blood that's being used to do that would be better used if it went to your leg muscles and your arm muscles if you're in a moment of crisis. So the body actually diverts the blood away from the stomach and the intestines and away from the skin and diverts it towards the heart, the arms, and the legs and muscles, because you may have to fight or run away in order to survive. All of that is done because adrenaline was produced by an endocrine gland, the adrenal glands, and it got sent out to the body and caused all of these sudden changes to occur. So that's just one easy example of how hormones are responsible for kind of large-scale thematic changes in the body. Okay, so what we're going to learn about in today's lecture is we will learn about the different types of hormones. They're what they are. They're basically intracellular signals that are sent from one group of cells to another and tells the target cell to turn some genes on or turn other genes off. Okay, and those intracellular signals are often sent by endocrine glands, which are groups of tissues that are made up of cells that all do the same thing. Then we'll talk about the types of hormones. I already mentioned the fact that you have steroid hormones, peptide hormones, and modified amino acid hormones. The steroid hormones are derived by modifying cholesterol. Remember that cholesterol is produced in large quantities in the cell, and it is put into the plasma membrane of the cells in order to make the plasma membrane more rigid and stronger. But if you produce cholesterol and then you modify it with a few decorations here and there, you can actually convert cholesterol into one of the steroid hormones, and there are several. So for instance, you might have heard of testosterone, which is a male hormone. Testosterone is a steroid hormone. There are other steroid hormones. Okay, and then a peptide hormone. The word peptide means a short protein. The word peptide means a short protein, so you do need to know that. If I ever asked you what is the difference between a protein and a peptide, you would say that a protein is made of hundreds of amino acids, if not thousands of amino acids, and a peptide is a short protein that is 10, 20, 30 amino acids. So when we did that exercise in the second week of class, when I had you translate a messenger RNA into three different messenger RNAs into three different proteins, I was actually cheating a little bit. Those would not be classified as proteins technically. Those things that you translated, which were, you had 12 base pairs, 4 codons, which translated into a 4 amino acid protein. Technically, that was not a protein that you built. It would have been classified as a peptide. So peptides are made of only a few amino acids. Proteins are generally made of hundreds of amino acids, if not thousands. At what point do you have to change the name from a peptide to a protein? I don't know. There's no rule. That's kind of like asking how long does a piece of string have to be before you start calling it a long piece of string versus a short piece of string. I don't know. There is no rule. So there is really no rule for when do you stop calling a peptide and start calling it a protein. How many amino acids do you have to have? And there is no actual rule, but generally a peptide is 10, 20, 30 amino acids in length, something like that, whereas a protein is generally at least a few hundred amino acids in length. So there are many hormones that are referred to as peptide hormones, and they are hormones, intercellular signals. Intercellular means sent between cells, signals that are sent between cells. And they are made of peptides. They're just a few amino acids put together that have the effect of stimulating receptors on the surface of the target cells. And then there are a few hormones that are modified, simply modified amino acids. So you take an amino acid and you put a few decorations onto it, and it becomes a hormone that signals cells to do things as well. Okay, now that is what the hormones are made of. They can either be steroid hormones, peptide hormones, or modified amino acids. That's what they're made of. What do you call? You give them special names depending on how far the signal is sent. So, endocrine signaling is where you send out hormones through the blood over long distances. Paracrine signaling is where you send out hormones from one cell to another over short distances. For instance, if you have 2 or 3 cells in the bone marrow, and one cell is signaling another cell to turn into red blood cells, the hormone that does that is called erythropoietin. But let's say you turn one type of a bone marrow stem cell into a fully fledged white blood cell, for example, like a granulocyte. The signals would be sent over short distances within the bone marrow itself, and that would be classified as paracrine signaling. And then autocrine signaling is where a cell stimulates itself to do something. Right, so it sends out a signal which is received by its own receptors on the surface of the cell, and it tells itself to do something. That's called autocrine. Okay, so there are 3 types of signaling: endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine. And I could ask you to tell me the difference between those. Okay, so now what about the endocrine glands? So there are a number of glands. Remember that a gland is classified as an organ that produces something, some sort of a liquid, and then sends it out someplace through a duct. Remember that a duct, D-U-C-T, duct, is a small tube. Okay, so endocrine glands have small tubes in them. Those tubes, the ducts, are lined on the inside of the lumen, the inner surface is lined with cuboidal epithelial cells. And those cuboidal epithelial cells are specialized to produce something, either hormones or steroid hormones, peptide hormones, or amino acid hormones. And those hormones are sent out to someplace else in the body through a duct. Okay, and then finally, we'll talk about. We will learn the names of the names and functions of the important endocrine glands in the body. We will have to memorize those. And then we'll talk about the difference, briefly talk about the difference between tropic hormones and regular hormones. A regular hormone is a signal that is sent from an endocrine gland, and the signal is sent out into the body that tells cells to do something. A tropic hormone is basically a hormone that's sent by an endocrine organ, and that signal that is sent out is sent to another endocrine organ and tells it to produce hormones. So it's a tropic hormone is a hormone that controls the production of hormones. So it's like a level of control that is superimposed on top of hormonal control. So tropic hormones are hormones that control the production and release of other hormones. And then at the end, we'll discuss some endocrine pathologies. In other words, we'll talk about how the endocrine system works, and then we'll talk about some of the things that happen when the endocrine system breaks down. So we'll talk about pathologies of the endocrine system. And then after that, because this is a science course that's meant primarily for art students, and art students don't necessarily want to know all the details of how the science works. They prefer to know what are the implications of this technology. So an art student who's taking this course might be interested in learning the details of how the endocrine system works, but they might be more interested in various controversial branches of research that people who study the endocrine system, what are they doing with it, and what kind of things are they doing with the endocrine system? What are they doing to fix it? What kind of exotic uses are the scientists who research the endocrine system doing? What kind of odd research? What kind of weird applications are they doing? Are these controversial applications? And what are the implications? What are the broader implications for society if they are allowed to continue this research? And one of the most interesting avenues of research for endocrinologists are people who study hormones and study the use of hormones for a living. One of the most interesting branches of research that endocrinologists are looking into at the moment are ways in which hormones can be used to extend the human lifespan. And also to increase the quality of living. So you know that humans are living longer now than they used to, but they're not necessarily more healthy as they get older. They're just living a longer period of time, but age continues. And so as people used to die at age 70 because of diseases that we now have the cures to. So people are now living to be 80, 90, or 100. But they're not necessarily enjoying their life because they may be disabled. The bones are very brittle. They have to be in a wheelchair. They might have to live in a nursing home, an extended care home. The word nursing home has fallen into disfavor these days. It's better to say an extended care home, which is the same thing. It's basically for people who are so old that their bodies have deteriorated to the point that they can no longer take care of themselves. And that is not necessarily, so you've managed to extend the human lifespan by curing diseases, but you haven't allowed people to age in a healthy way. They continue to age and organ systems in the body continue to fall apart and deteriorate to the point where you're living a lot longer, but you're not really enjoying your life at that point. So one of the things that hormonal research endocrinologists are studying are ways that hormone therapy, where you inject elderly people with hormones as you go from middle age to old age, you give people supplementary hormones. You give them extra hormones that their body has stopped producing. And that can actually maybe not extend the number of years that you live, but will certainly allow you to be healthier as you grow older. The most obvious one is a hormone called human growth hormone. So when we're young, our body produces human growth hormone that allows us to grow taller. So that's how we go from being a short little child to a tall adult. But that hormone continues to be produced into your 40s and 50s, which allows your, which basically keeps your organ systems in good working order. It allows you to, when the cells die, human growth hormone allows other cells to divide and replace the cells that have died. Because basically when you age, what's happening is that your cells are wearing out and dying, but they're no longer being replaced. When you're young, cells die, they wear out and die, but they are replaced by other cells that divide to take up the gap. And so as you get older, the reason why you start to deteriorate is because the cells are wearing out and dying and they're not being replaced. And so human growth hormone, if you could find some way to continue producing human growth hormone as you go from your 40s into your 50s and 60s and 70s, then you could live a much healthier life and a much more enjoyable life. And so human growth hormone, they are doing some experimentation with human growth hormone in order to extend the quality of human life, to increase the quality of human life with advanced age. And in the context of that, I'm also going to discuss some other technologies that are being examined that hope to extend the lifespan of humans and hope to expand quality into old age. But now let's start off by just talking about the regular endocrine system. Okay, what do hormones do? They are involved in gene regulation. The term gene regulation means turning genes on and off, basically. It's a fancy word that geneticists use that means turning genes on and turning them off when they're supposed to be. Okay, so gene regulation is turning genes on and off. Hormones are signals that are sent from one cell to another, or from one group of cells to another, or from one organ to a group of cells that tell those cells to turn certain genes on or turn certain genes off and start producing something or stop producing something, or to divide or to differentiate into a different type of cell. That's what hormones do. Hormones are a way of regulating genes in other cells. So hormones are produced and secreted by endocrine glands. The ducts of those glands are surrounded by cuboidal epithelium that is specialized to produce hormones and then send it out. Different types of hormones. Okay, so lipid hormones are basically the steroid hormones, which are made from modifying cholesterol. Peptide hormones are small proteins. And then we have modified amino acids, which are another type of hormones, but they all are doing basically the same thing. The main functional difference between steroid hormones versus peptide hormones and modified amino acid hormones is that, first of all, steroid hormones are made of lipids. You already know that lipids are hydrophobic, so they will not dissolve in blood or lymphatic fluid. So steroid hormones cannot be transported from one part of the body to the other in the blood or in the lymph. Instead, they have to be transported from one place to another. They literally have to be carried from one place to another by soluble proteins that are called carrier proteins. So steroid hormones have to be transported around the body by soluble proteins that are called carrier proteins. And once the carrier proteins have brought those steroid hormones to their destination, brought them to the target cells, they release them. Steroid hormones are able to cross the plasma membrane directly. They get inside the cell and they go directly to the nucleus. And steroid hormones go directly to the nucleus of a cell and turn some genes on and turn other genes off. That's what steroid hormones do. Peptide hormones and amino acids do not do that. First of all, peptide hormones and amino acid hormones are soluble in fluids, so they don't need protein carriers to carry them from one place in the body to the other. And furthermore, the other difference is that they cannot penetrate the plasma membrane. Instead, what they do is they stimulate or activate receptors, cellular receptors that are on the surface of those cells. And those receptors then have a way of transmitting the signal from the surface of the cell to the nucleus, where the genes are, and turning certain genes on and off. That process of stimulating a receptor on the surface, activating a receptor on the surface of the cell, and transmitting the signal to the nucleus is referred to as signal transduction. I'll show you how that's spelled in a minute. And so the process of signal transduction is very complicated, and we don't understand all of it yet. And there are thousands of scientists around the world who have dedicated their entire lives to unraveling and understanding how signal transduction works. And we probably still don't know even half of how it works. But signal transduction is a very active area of research in human biology, trying to figure out how signals are sent from activated receptors on the surface of the cell through a series of secondary messengers, as they're called. Secondary messengers that transmit, a receptor is activated, and then on the inside of the cell, the receptor activates another protein, which activates another protein, which activates another protein, which transmits the signal to the nucleus. Those proteins that get activated, several of them in sequence on the inside of the cell, they are referred to as secondary messengers, and they basically relay the signal from the cell surface to the nucleus where genes are told to turn on and off. That process is called signal transduction. All right, now two special types of peptide hormones are two classes of peptide hormones are the cytokines and the interleukins. You may recall from the chapter on the immune system, when we talked about hematopoiesis, we talked about the fact that interleukins are peptide hormones that are sent over short distances from one leukocyte to another. Hence the term leukins. Interleukins comes from leukocytes. So these are signals. The interleukins are signals, a series of signals that are sent between white blood cells, and there are dozens of them. And in fact, the simplest, the nomenclature, the naming system for the interleukins is actually quite simple. They are simply called IL-1. The letters IL stand for interleukin. So we have interleukin 1, interleukin 2, interleukin 3, interleukin 4, etc. And then we have cytokines. The cytokines are also basically signals that are sent between cells, usually over short distances, but sometimes over long distances. And so when we looked at the diagram for the immune system, when we talked about the hematopoiesis and the different lineages for blood cells and how you go from being a general stem cell to a platelet or a granulocyte or an eosinophil through being stimulated by different combinations of cytokines and interleukins. So you remember that chart that I showed you that explained, sort of in clumsy terms, it explained how you convert a bone marrow stem cell, a hematopoietic stem cell, into a platelet or an eosinophil or an erythrocyte by stimulating it with different combinations of cytokines and interleukins. All right, so the steroid hormones, as I mentioned, they are hydrophobic, so they don't dissolve in blood. If you're going to transport them from one place to another, you have to do this using carrier proteins. And once they are delivered to their target cells, they can penetrate the cell membrane directly because remember, the cholesterol is normally embedded in the plasma membrane anyway, so it must be able to interact with the plasma membrane and get inside it fairly easily. So steroid hormones penetrate the cell membrane directly, easily, and then they are carried to the nucleus by carrier proteins on the inside of the cell, in the cytoplasm of the cell. They enter the nucleus directly, and then they make contact with proteins inside the nucleus that turn genes on and turn genes off. Peptide hormones and amino acids tend to be hydrophilic, so they dissolve in blood plasma quite easily. They also dissolve in lymphatic fluid or interstitial fluid. Remember, interstitial fluid is the fluid that exists between cells inside soft tissue. An example of soft tissue would be adipose tissue, for instance. And they cannot penetrate the plasma membrane, so instead they interact with receptors that are on the surface of the cells. The thing that interacts with the receptor is sort of usually generally referred to as a ligand. The word ligand means just something that joins to something else, right? So ligand is the thing that attaches to the receptor. In this case, the ligand that we're talking about is a cytokine or an interleukin. So once the receptor on the surface of the cell has been stimulated or activated, a series of secondary messengers or secondary signals is used to relay that activation signal to the nucleus, and that whole process is a branch of cell biology which is called signal transduction. So signal transduction is the process of transmitting the signal from a receptor on the surface of the cell through a series of secondary messengers, through a series of intermediate messengers to the nucleus. Okay, so we have two types of endocrine glands that produce these hormones. There are endocrine glands that produce regular hormones that are sent to other parts of the body that tell the body to undergo changes. And there are also tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are produced by endocrine glands, and the signals then stimulate other endocrine organs. So tropic hormones are hormones that are produced and which control the production of other hormones by other endocrine organs. So we'll talk about the difference between tropic hormones and regular hormones. Okay, so we said different types of signaling. Endocrine signaling is where an endocrine gland produces a hormone and sends it out into the blood. So the endocrine signaling is hormone signaling that relies on transportation through the bloodstream. Paracrine signaling refers to transportation of the signal over a short distance, such as between two white blood cells in the bone marrow, for instance. That would be an example, or through interstitial fluid. And autocrine signaling is where a cell produces a signal that stimulates itself to do something, so it stimulates its own receptors to do something. And then finally we have one that I haven't mentioned before, and that is called neuroendocrine signaling. And that is when neurons are part of the nervous system. They produce the neurons in the brain decide they're going to do something, and they produce a hormone that is sent to endocrine glands. Okay, so one of the best examples of this, pay attention and remember this example because I'm about to discuss it in a minute or two. A perfect example of neuroendocrine signaling is where the hypothalamus, which is officially a part of the brain, and the hypothalamus is officially part of the brain and it is made of neurons, it receives signals. Now, do you remember way back from when we were discussing the renal system a couple of lectures ago? We said that the hypothalamus contains a certain specialized type of a neuron called an osmoreceptor, which senses how salty the blood is. And if the blood is too salty, the osmoreceptors will produce signals, and they will stimulate the pituitary gland to produce antidiuretic hormone, which puts more aquaporin channels into the collecting duct of the kidney and causes us to retain more water instead of losing the water through urination. Okay, so the act of the hypothalamus producing hormones that stimulate the pituitary gland to produce antidiuretic hormone is a perfect example of neuroendocrine signaling. So if I ever asked you to give me one example of neuroendocrine signaling, that's the one that you can give me. All right, let's look at the most important endocrine glands in the body. We're only going to learn about a dozen of them. Okay, so first we have the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, but it is classified as part of the endocrine system, and it's located right there. Next, the pituitary gland is a small gland that's about the size of a pea, and it's located just below the hypothalamus. There's another gland in the brain called the pineal gland that is located sort of posterior to the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is mainly responsible for stimulating the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a fascinating endocrine organ. It's a fascinating endocrine gland because it's capable of producing about a dozen different hormones that all have different purposes. So for such a small organ, it has very profound effects on the human body. So the pituitary gland produces lots of different hormones, and about half of them are tropic hormones. The pineal gland is a little bit less interesting. It only produces one hormone called melatonin, which makes us sleepy. So when you go to sleep at night, it's because your pineal gland is producing melatonin, which makes you sleepy. And you should know that a certain amount of light is able to diffuse from your eyes to the brain. So some light kind of filters through the back of your eyes, the retinas of your eyes, and provides light on the inside of the brain. And you should know that the pineal gland pineal gland produces melatonin, but the pineal gland is inhibited. It's inhibited by light. So that means that it's very difficult for you to sleep when it's light. It's easy for you to sleep when it's dark, but it's difficult for you to sleep when it's light because the pineal gland is inhibited by the light. So the pineal gland cannot produce melatonin if it's light outside. So if you need to go to sleep and it's light, you put on a sleep mask, you know, those kind of things that look like glasses that block the light from coming in through your eyes, block the light from diffusing in through your eyelids. And in fact, what you're doing when you're doing that is you're cutting off the light that travels inside the brain and inhibits the pineal gland from producing melatonin. Sometimes people who have trouble sleeping can buy melatonin pills over the counter from the pharmacist. So some people do their, if they're having trouble getting to sleep, they buy some melatonin and they take it. Small amounts of melatonin will help you to go to sleep at night. Okay, the thyroid gland is located in the throat, just below the larynx. Do you remember when we talked about the respiratory system? We talked about the larynx, and the top of the larynx is located at the top of the trachea that leads to the lungs. And you remember on the front part of the trachea, there's a kind of a bunch of cartilage that's called thyroid cartilage. And that thyroid cartilage is called thyroid cartilage because the thyroid gland sits on the anterior side of the thyroid cartilage. Okay, but the thyroid gland is not part of the respiratory system. It's part of the endocrine system, and it produces two hormones. One's called thyroid hormone and the other is called calcitonin, that do different things. So there's the thyroid gland. And if you turn the thyroid gland around, you'll see that on the back of the thyroid gland, on the posterior side of the thyroid gland, there are four little organs, each of which is about the size of a pea. Those four little organs are called the parathyroid glands. Okay. Now this is a little bit confusing. They've included the thymus on this chart, which is located just above the aorta. The thymus, do you remember what happens in the thymus? It has something to do with the immune system. Do you remember that T helper cells go to the thymus in order to develop and learn how to tell the difference between your tissues and foreign invading tissues, right? That's what the thymus does, and it is not part of the endocrine system, it's part of the immune system. But I've left it on this diagram to remind you to not confuse the thyroid gland with the thymus. Do not confuse the thyroid gland with the thymus. That's a common way that I try to trick students on exams. I ask you, ask you, is thyroid hormone produced by the thymus or the thyroid, or something like that. Okay, and every year I succeed in fooling a few students because they didn't memorize the difference between the thyroid gland and the thymus and which organ system they belong to. Now let's move on to the kidneys. You can see the kidneys, of course, are part of the renal system, but on top of each kidney there's a little tiny gland that's called the adrenal gland that produces some hormones. We'll learn at least 3 of them. Okay, the kidneys are not part of the endocrine system. Remember the pancreas? The pancreas produces digestive enzymes that are added to which part of the digestive system? Which part of the pancreas produces the pancreas produces digestive enzymes, proteases, lipases, and so on, and it dumps them into a certain part of the intestine. Which part? Do you remember? It's the duodenum. So the pancreas produces digestive enzymes that are sent through a duct to the duodenum. So the pancreas is classified as being part of the digestive system. However, other parts of the pancreas also produce hormones. The pancreas also produces two different peptide hormones that regulate the amount of glucose that is present in your bloodstream. using a homeostatic process. So the amount of glucose that's located, the amount of glucose that's dissolved in your blood, the glucose concentration in your blood is controlled by two hormones that are secreted by the pancreas. So because of this dual role, the pancreas is considered to be part of the digestive system when we're talking about the digestive hormones that it produces, and it is also considered to be part of the endocrine system when we talk about the hormones that regulate the concentration of glucose in the blood. Okay, now down here we have the reproductive system, and we have the ovaries, which are the little organs that produce eggs in females, in women. And we also have the testes that produce the sperm in men. So the ovaries and the testes are both considered to be part of the endocrine system, because the ovaries produce eggs for women and the testes produce sperm for men, but they also produce hormones that cause body changes during puberty, during adolescence. So as soon as the ovaries start producing a class of hormones called the estrogens, that is when girls develop from being girls into women. They start developing breasts, and they start developing the typical female shape, and they start to menstruate, they start to bleed. So that is those body changes that women undergo when they go from being girls to women. Those changes, large-scale changes to the body, are mediated by a class of hormones that are called the estrogens, and the estrogens are produced by the ovaries. I should mention that they're produced by the ovaries in response to tropic hormones that come from the pituitary gland. And the same is true for men. So when boys develop from boys into men, they get bigger, they develop more muscles, all of that stuff. They start developing facial hair. All of that is controlled by a series of hormones called the androgens that are produced by the testes. The androgens are produced by the testes in response to tropic hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland as well. So it's the pituitary gland that controls a lot of these processes, and the pituitary gland produces a lot of tropic hormones, but it also produces a few regular hormones. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the important endocrine organs. Let's look at them in detail one by one. All right, let's start with the hypothalamus, which is located here in the brain. There you can see it. The hypothalamus is located here, right above the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is officially part of the brain. It's made of neurons, and it senses things about the body. I mentioned the osmoreceptors that sense how salty the blood is and so on. And the pituitary gland is located just underneath the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is part of the brain, and it makes a lot of decisions about which hormones to release from the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus kind of, in many ways, controls the pituitary gland, tells the pituitary gland which hormones to release under what conditions. Example, the first example that we've already had is the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone, which is also known as vasopressin. So let's take a closer look at the pituitary gland. Okay, so the pituitary gland is located here below the hypothalamus. Okay, so it's located just below the hypothalamus. It's about the size of a pea, and it secretes about a dozen different hormones, many of which are tropic. It turns out that the pituitary gland secretes so many hormones that it's actually easier to keep track of the hormones that are secreted by the pituitary gland by dividing it into two parts called the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. So as you can guess, you have a little endocrine organ that's about the size of a pea, and the front part of it that's located facing forward is called the anterior pituitary gland, and then the back side of the pituitary gland is the posterior pituitary gland. Let's start with the easy part. The posterior pituitary gland secretes only two important hormones that we're going to learn about for this course. You are responsible for memorizing them both. The first one you already know about. The posterior pituitary gland produces antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. Antidiuretic hormone tells the collecting, it's responsible for putting more aquaporin channels into the collecting ducts of the nephridia, and therefore you retain more water. So antidiuretic hormone is produced by the posterior pituitary gland. Next, oxytocin is a hormone that causes contractions of the uterus, uterine contractions. So when a woman is giving birth to a baby, the uterus contracts and pushes the baby out. Right? And that is caused by the pushing. The pushing is caused by smooth muscles around the uterus, and that pushing, those contractions are mediated by oxytocin, which is produced in the posterior pituitary gland. Oxytocin also causes milk to be secreted from the mammary glands. Mammary glands are commonly called the breasts if you're talking about human women. If you're talking about other mammals, we just call them the mammary glands. So tigers and lions and whales and dolphins all have mammary glands, the females do. And when milk is produced by those mammary glands, it's referred to as lactation. So lactation refers to production of milk by the mammary glands. That is something that only happens slightly before and slightly after a woman has had a baby. Right? So in the old days, when humans used to keep other humans for slaves or even just as servants, sometimes if a very important high society woman had a baby, but she didn't have time to sit around all day nursing the baby, feeding the baby, she didn't want to spend all her time breastfeeding the baby, the family would either hire or buy a wet nurse, what's called a wet nurse. So a wet nurse is a woman who can feed the baby with breast milk for that woman. But you can't just hire or buy any woman. It has to be a woman who just gave birth herself, because women are only lactating around the time of birth for the first few months. For a few months after birth, a woman is lactating, producing milk. But if you just take a regular woman who hasn't had a baby recently or who is not about to have a baby, the breasts are not producing milk. So you notice, of course, that when a woman becomes pregnant, the breasts enlarge for a short period of time. They become enlarged for a while because they're filling up with milk and with the tissues that produce milk. So that process is called lactation, and it only happens around the time of giving birth. And that process, the process of lactation, the secretion part is controlled by oxytocin. So let's just say don't confuse the secretion of milk with the production of milk, because the production of milk is controlled by another hormone that is produced by the anterior pituitary gland. So oxytocin only controls the secretion of milk. Often in response to the mother hearing the baby cry, right? So sometimes a woman who's been feeding her baby, as soon as she hears the baby cry, that's a signal that the baby might be hungry. As soon as she hears the baby cry, the breasts automatically start secreting milk in response to hearing the baby cry. And that secretion, the release of the milk from the breast, is controlled by oxytocin. Okay, so the production of milk is controlled by another hormone called prolactin, which is produced by the anterior pituitary gland. And oxytocin causes the milk to be released. Okay, let's look at some hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland, by the front part of the pituitary gland. So we have thyroid stimulating hormone, THS. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. Okay, so thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is itself an endocrine gland which secretes hormones. So therefore, by definition, thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone. I could ask you, give me an example of a tropic hormone and give me an example of a non-tropic hormone. Okay, so we just talked about antidiuretic hormone produced by the posterior pituitary gland. Which organ does antidiuretic hormone affect? Antidiuretic hormone affects the kidneys, and the kidneys are not endocrine glands. They have the adrenal gland on top of the kidney, but that's a separate organ. The kidney itself is not an endocrine organ. Antidiuretic hormone affects the kidney, and it does not, which is not an endocrine organ. Therefore, antidiuretic hormone is an example of a regular hormone, which is not a tropic hormone. So right away, if I asked you to give me an example of a tropic hormone, you can say thyroid stimulating hormone. If I said give me an example of a non-tropic hormone, a regular hormone, you could say antidiuretic hormone. Okay, now here's a name that looks like it's hard to memorize, but it's not so hard if you break it down into its parts. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is abbreviated ACTH. Okay, so now adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal glands to secrete a certain type of hormones, which we'll discuss in a minute. But adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now you remember that. So let's break this word down into parts so that we can memorize it more easily. Adreno refers to the adrenal gland. So this hormone stimulates the adrenal glands. Then you remember that we said that we normally, when you talk about an organ, you talk about the surface of the organ is called the cortex, and the inner part of the organ is called the medulla. Okay, so adrenocortico, the word cortico refers to the cortex. The cortex of what? The cortex of the adrenal gland. So adrenocortico refers to a hormone that stimulates the cortex of the adrenal gland. And if the adrenal gland is considered to be an endocrine organ, so we're talking about a hormone that stimulates another endocrine organ, so by definition it is a tropic hormone. So adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the outer part of the adrenal gland to secrete a class of hormones that are called corticosteroids, and we'll talk about those in a minute. All right, another hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone. The follicles are little clusters of cells that are located. You've heard of hair follicles? Well, we're not talking about those. We're talking about another type of follicle. In this case, we're talking about the follicles, which are little clusters of cells that are located on the inside of the ovaries, the female ovaries where the eggs are produced, and it stimulates the production of eggs in the ovaries of women, and it stimulates the production of sperm in the testes of men. It also stimulates the release of estradiol from the ovaries in women. Right, so follicle stimulating hormone is stimulating the ovaries and the testes. The ovaries and the testes are both classified as endocrine organs. So therefore, follicle stimulating hormone is also classified as a tropic hormone. Okay, finally, luteinizing hormone is produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and it causes the production of androgens by the testes. Androgens are male-specific sex hormones, and it causes the production of progesterone by the ovaries. Progesterone is one of the estrogens that is a female sex hormone. And so luteinizing hormone, LH, abbreviated LH, is by definition a tropic hormone as well. So these are all four of these are classified as tropic hormones. Now let's look at some hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland that are not tropic, non-tropic hormones. So growth hormone controls the growth of the body. I mentioned before, when we grow from being short children to tall adults, it is growth hormone that's responsible for the elongation of the long bones in the arms and the legs that causes that growth, as well as elongation of the torso bones. Prolactin causes the production but not the release of milk. Right? So remember, the other hormone, oxytocin, causes release of the milk. It's prolactin that causes production of the milk. Okay, now melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, is another hormone that is non-tropic. It stimulates a specialized type of cell that is found in your skin that is referred to as a melanocyte. So a melanocyte produces a brown pigment called melanin. So don't make this mistake. Don't confuse melanin with melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone that's produced by the pineal gland, which makes you sleepy. That's melatonin. Melanin, melanin is a brown pigment. The word pigment means colored chemical, a pigment. You remember that, when they, sometimes when you talk about an artist who's mixing paints, an artist will refer to their colored paints as pigments. What's the pigment on that painting? Some of you that have taken art history know about pigments. And what pigments do you have to put together to make colored paints? That was something that the Renaissance artists had to worry about. So the term pigment means a colored compound, a colored chemical of some sort. Right? So melanin is a brown pigment that is produced by melanocytes, and it is produced in response to sun. Right? So that if you're out in the sun, when you get a suntan, it's because your brain told your anterior pituitary gland to produce melanocyte stimulating hormone. That hormone triggers the melanocytes in your skin to produce melanin, which is a brown pigment. If you put this brown pigment into your skin, the chances, the odds, it will actually absorb some of the sunlight and reduce the amount of damage that sunlight can do to your cells. So what type of damage can sunlight do to your cells? Well, one of the most obvious types of damage is sunlight, ultraviolet radiation, ultraviolet UV light from the sun can actually break and mutate DNA, which causes genetic mutations. And anything that causes genetic mutations stands a chance of mutating the genes that are responsible for cell division, the genes that are responsible for controlling cell division, and therefore they could cause skin cancer. Most of the time it doesn't, but ultraviolet radiation from the sun very often damages the DNA in the cells, and once in a while it causes damage or a mutation to a gene that controls cell division. So the cell starts dividing when it's not supposed to be dividing. It starts uncontrolled cell division, runaway cell division, if you will, and that's what cancer is, runaway cell division, when a cell starts dividing and never knows when to stop. So the sun is capable of doing that to the cells of your skin. If the melanocytes produce melanin, that brown pigment will absorb some of the UV radiation and kind of diffuse it so that it does less damage to the DNA. So melanin is a natural protectant from the sunlight. Okay, so whether you have fair skin or dark skin, your skin is still capable of producing more melanin in response to sunlight, and that's the result of melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, as I mentioned earlier on when we talked about the bones, I mentioned the fact that vitamin D allows your intestines to absorb calcium when you eat it, which gives strength to the bones. Now, if you have melanin in your skin, that actually interferes with the production of vitamin D. So what that means is that if you have a dark complexion, if you have dark skin, you should definitely take a vitamin D supplement, especially in a northern latitude like Canada, because there's not enough, we're not getting much sun to begin with. And then if you have darker skin, that's interfering with the production of vitamin D as well. If you have dark skin and you're located in the tropics where you get lots of sun, or at the equator, near the equator, it's not a problem because you get enough sun so that there's lots of sunlight, you have lots of pigment in your skin to prevent skin cancer, but there's also sufficient sunlight to allow enough vitamin D to be produced. If you take people who have a darker complexion and move them to a far north, the far north or the far south, there's not enough sunlight to produce a sufficient amount of vitamin D, so it's better to take a supplement. Okay, so people who have fair skin have the opposite problem. Their skin is actually more efficient at producing vitamin D from the little amount of sunlight that we get, but if you move those people close to the tropics or close to the equator where there's lots of sun, they often get skin cancer more easily because they don't have enough brown pigment in the skin to prevent it. So it's a trade-off. A dark skin tone versus a light skin tone. Light skin tone is more efficient at making vitamin D in an environment where you don't get much sunlight, but it's not particularly good at preventing skin cancer, but it doesn't matter because you don't get enough sunlight to cause a lot of skin cancer. if you transport those fair-skinned people to an area that gets a lot of sunlight, like Australia, for instance, you know, the people who the native Australians, the native Australian Aboriginals who lived in Australia have dark skin because Australia gets a lot of sunlight. When the English and the British started colonizing Australia, and now there are all these fair-skinned people who live in Australia, there's a very high incidence of skin cancer in Australia due to the sunlight. The amount of sunlight and the lack of pigment in their skin to do anything about it or to guard against it. All right, so melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, stimulates the melanocytes in the skin to produce pigment. You may have a baseline that includes more pigment. Some people have a baseline that includes more or less pigment than others. You know, your skin is darker or lighter to begin with. But either way, sunlight can cause melanocytes to produce more pigment and give you more protection from the sunlight. All right, once more through with these hormones. Growth hormone controls how tall your body becomes. The pituitary gland produces a lot of growth hormone during adolescence. That's the teenage years when we have our biggest growing periods, and also during childhood. Sometimes people have a problem with the pituitary gland, so it produces too much growth hormone. That ends up being a condition called giantism. So this man on the right had a dysfunctioning pituitary gland, so it caused him to just keep on growing. The man on the left is normal size, 2 meters in height. This man was like twice that much, one of the tallest men ever. This is Charlotte Garside, who is one of the smallest people in the world, and she has a form of pituitary dwarfism that's called pituitary dwarfism because it's caused by a problem with the pituitary gland. Now, normally, if you have a child who has pituitary dwarfism, this child, Charlotte Garside, I believe she's 7 years old there. So she's quite small for a 7-year-old, and she never grew much more than that. And it was caused by a problem with the pituitary or the growth hormone itself. So she had a dysfunctional type of growth hormone, not necessarily a pituitary gland that didn't produce enough growth hormone. But there is a condition called pituitary dwarfism where the pituitary gland doesn't produce enough growth hormone, and there's an easy way to correct for that these days. You simply give the child supplements, pills of growth hormone, and then they grow to a normal size. Okay, so this is an example of pituitary dwarfism where either the pituitary gland doesn't produce enough growth hormone, or there's something wrong with the growth hormone that is produced, or in the case of Charlotte Garside, had a very rare condition where the growth hormone receptors were dysfunctional. So there was no way that they could give her growth hormone supplements, pills, in order to grow to a normal size because she had a problem with the growth hormone receptors. Pituitary dwarfism should not be confused with achondroplasia. Okay, there's another type of dwarfism called achondroplasia, which is a problem with another type of a hormone receptor. So here we have Peter Dinklage, who's a star of the TV show Game of Thrones. It's very popular, but I've never seen it. But he became famous. He's an example of a dwarf who is a dwarf because of achondroplasia, which is a totally different disease. So there's a different condition called pituitary dwarfism versus achondroplasia. Don't get them mixed up. Don't confuse the two. All right, now here's another example of growth hormone. So do you know who this is? Maybe some of you know this guy. His name is Arnold Schwarzenegger. In 1970, he was a champion bodybuilder. He was the Mr. Universe, I think it's called, is like the world championship bodybuilder in 1970. Bodybuilders often, they claim that in the old days they used to claim that they didn't inject steroid hormones in order to build muscle more easily. But we all know today that there are lots of people around who inject themselves with a steroid hormone called human growth hormone. And one of the things that so we're talking about human growth hormone that determines your height, but after you're finished growing, it continues to allow you to build tissues, body tissues. So if you inject yourself with human growth hormone and then you exercise with heavy weights, you build up all these muscles in your body and then you become a bodybuilder. In the old days, bodybuilders, it was illegal for bodybuilders to use steroids. They're commonly called anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroid. Do you remember from the earlier lecture where the term anabolism means to build tissues? So human growth hormone is another example of an anabolic steroid. It helps us to grow tall when we're in our adolescence, but your body continues to produce human growth hormone into your 30s and 40s and 50s, and it starts to decline and produce less human growth hormone over the age of 50 or so, thereabouts, which means that when you're young, when you're in your 20s, if you do exercise in the gym like this, you can build up these big, impressive, intimidating looking muscles easily. And then when you're old, you can't. You no longer can, because the reason for that is because your body is producing less human growth hormone. It's not you can do the same amount of weightlifting, but you will build less muscle, because in order to build muscle you need anabolic steroids. Specifically, you need human growth hormone. So Arnold Schwarzenegger claimed he was the champion bodybuilder in 1970, and then he decided he wanted to go into movies, and so he became a movie star. He was a star of the movie called The Terminator, and then later on he ran for governor of California. California is the largest state in the United States. It has 30 million people, which is the entire population of Canada, and California, of course, is located on the southwest part of the United States. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, he went from being a bodybuilder to a movie star to being governor of California, which I think is a ridiculous thing. I mean, he had no experience of government, but he ran for and won the governorship of California. So he became the governor of California with all of his experience of government, obviously, that he gained from being a movie star and a bodybuilder. I'm being sarcastic, of course. Okay, now he claimed that he never used steroid hormones. And you can judge for yourself whether you believe that or not. But this is Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the world champion men's bodybuilder in 1970. In 1970, only men did bodybuilding. Women didn't do that. They thought it was silly. Today, however, there are women bodybuilders. Okay, now this is a modern female bodybuilder, and look at her. She has bigger muscles than the world champion male bodybuilder from 1970. And bodybuilders no longer make a secret of the fact that they use growth hormones in order to do this. So with the aid of growth hormones, the female bodybuilders of 2021 are bigger than the male bodybuilders of 1970. And this is the result of supplementing themselves with, injecting yourself with growth hormone and enlarging the muscles artificially. So you do, if a woman did not inject herself with human growth hormone, she could lift weights all day long and she would never look like this. But with the help of growth hormones, this is what you get. Okay, so if the women bodybuilders of 2021 look like this, what do the male bodybuilders of 2021 look like? They look like this. And this is artificial, so it's the result of a combination of hard work in the gymnasium plus science, artificial hormone therapy. So this guy has an arm that's bigger than Arnold Schwarzenegger's chest, right? Okay, so that's what they do these days with hormones. Okay, now this is kind of a silly use of hormones. There are much better things that we could do with it, such as extending the quality of human life, which is one of the things they are doing research into. Okay, now one of the things that you notice about hormone therapy is that if you inject yourself with human growth hormones, you get something which is called acromegaly. So remember what acromegaly is. It means an enlarged face with a lantern jaw. You know that you've heard the expression a lantern jaw or a big square jaw is a symptom of, it's a characteristic of having a big wave of growth hormones during adolescence. So some people have that naturally. Having a really big square jaw like this is a characteristic of a dysfunctional pituitary gland. So somebody who has giantism, which is caused by an overactive pituitary gland, an overactive pituitary gland that produces more growth hormones than it's supposed to, a person like that will have a disease called giantism, or a dysfunction, a condition called giantism. And one of the symptoms of giantism, in addition to being really tall because you had an overactive pituitary gland, in addition to being tall, you have this big square jaw. That is also a characteristic of people who've been injecting, bodybuilders who've been injecting steroids, right? So you see this bodybuilder on the right has a big square jaw, and the woman that I showed you before that had a big square jaw. So that's acromegaly, and it's a telltale sign of either an overactive pituitary, or more likely somebody who's been injecting themselves with massive amounts of growth hormone and then exercising in order to build big muscles. But if they claim that they build those big muscles without the use of hormones, and then you look at their face and they have a big square jaw, you know that they're lying to you, right? Because the big square jaw, acromegaly, is a telltale sign that they were using growth hormones. So Arnold Schwarzenegger told us that he got big like that without using hormones, but just take a look at his jaw. That's a clear sign of acromegaly, so I think he's probably not being truthful if he ever says that he didn't use steroid hormones in 1970. All right, so let's take a look, a review of these pituitary gland hormones. Some of them, if you look at this list, can you tell me which ones are produced by the anterior versus the posterior pituitary gland? Because I would ask you that on a test. I might also ask which ones are tropic and which ones are non-tropic. Okay, so make sure you can do that. Okay, so these are all produced by the anterior pituitary gland. These are produced by the posterior, which are tropic. These are the tropic hormones, and the ones below that are the non-tropic hormones. Okay, let's move on to the pineal gland. Pineal gland produces melatonin that makes you sleepy. It helps you to go to sleep. Light diffuses through the eyes into the posterior part of the brain where the pineal gland is located, and light inhibits pineal gland production of melatonin. So if you're having trouble sleeping because it's light, you put on a sleep mask, right? And that the cycle of being sleepy when it's dark and being awake when it's light is one of a series of body functions that's known as circadian rhythms. I'm sure many of you know that a circadia is a cricket that comes out at night and chirps and disappears during the daytime and shuts up during the daytime. So it's a circadia cricket lives with a day-night cycle. So it lives with it's meant to be awake at night and asleep during the day. These are, there are a series of functions that the body does based on what time of the day it is, and those are called circadian rhythms or biorhythms. Okay, so melatonin is one of the hormones that helps with our circadian rhythms, and it makes us sleepy. It's produced when it's dark, and it is stopped from being produced when it's light because the pineal gland is inhibited by light. So if you're having trouble sleeping because you took a flight from one country to another, and you flew someplace, and you're from Vancouver, you fly someplace, you fly to Southeast Asia, and it's light, it's 12 noon in Southeast Asia, whereas it's supposed to be midnight in Vancouver time. And you want to go to sleep and take a nap, but you can't because it's broad daylight outside. So what you do is you put on a sleep mask and cover up your eyes, and then the melatonin can be produced from the pineal gland. Same reason why you have to put a cover over a bird cage, because as soon as the sun comes up, the bird will start chirping. The bird cannot sleep in the dark. So if you're staying up late and you have lights on in your house, you have to cover up the bird cage, or the bird will stay awake. The bird won't get any sleep. And of course, it's because the bird has a pineal gland as well. Okay, so you buy a sleep mask. Now, there are some people who buy melatonin over the counter of a pharmacist, and this is where you simply take pills and it makes you sleepy. I used to have insomnia when I was younger, and I took melatonin for a while, but one of the side effects of melatonin is that for some people, not for everybody, but for some people it gives you nightmares. So I just happened to be one of those people who got nightmares when I took melatonin, so I stopped taking it. I thought it was better to have insomnia than, to wake up feeling physically refreshed, but emotionally traumatized because I'd been having these terrible nightmares all night. All right, the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is located just below the larynx. And if you look at the thyroid gland from the front, you see the thyroid. If you take it out and look at it from the back, you see that this is a posterior view of the thyroid gland. You see that there are 4 little pea-sized glands embedded on the posterior side of the thyroid, and those are called the parathyroid glands. There are 4 of them. Right? Now, the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone and another hormone called calcitonin. Thyroid hormone increases the body's general metabolism, and it increases the rate at which the mitochondria in the body are converting glucose into ATP. So if you're energetic, it's because if you feel energetic, one of the reasons could be that your thyroid gland is producing lots of thyroid hormone, which speeds up the metabolism of your mitochondria in your cells, and gives you energy because a lot of the glucose is being burned. The glucose is being converted to ATP, and you're burning more energy. You have more available energy, and so you feel more energetic. So that is a function of the thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is produced by the thyroid gland in response to thyroid stimulating hormone, and the thyroid stimulating hormone is produced by the pituitary gland. Okay, so the other hormone, calcitonin, is involved in bone remodeling. Okay, so let's talk about the hormones. Once again, don't confuse the thyroid with the thymus. The thymus is part of the immune system. The thyroid is part of the endocrine system. Okay, so the activity of the thyroid is controlled by the anterior pituitary gland using thyroid stimulating hormone, and it produces 2 hormones. Thyroid hormone, abbreviated TH, increases the general metabolic rate and speeds up the conversion of glucose into ATP. ATP is the main source of energy in the body. Now, some of you that know a little bit about physics know that whenever you convert one form of energy into another form of energy, a lot of the energy is lost as heat. That's one of the reasons why the AC-DC converter that you plug your computer into heats up all the time, because you're converting AC power into DC power, and a lot of the energy is lost as heat. So the conversion of glucose into ATP is not a 100% efficient reaction. What happens is that of all the energy that you have from if you take a glucose molecule and you break it down into ATP, about half the energy that was contained in the covalent bonds of the glucose molecule was lost as heat. Okay, so the practical implication of that is that the body temperature will go up as a result of producing a lot of thyroid hormone. Okay, so that's a good way to warm yourself up, by the way, right? So your thyroid gland to produce more thyroid hormone. Okay, the other hormone that's produced by the thyroid gland is calcitonin, which reduces the calcium level in the blood. It causes calcium to be absorbed into the bone, right? So calcitonin causes calcitonin causes calcium to be absorbed into the bone. And then if we turn around and look on the back side of the thyroid gland, you see the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands produce a hormone called parathyroid hormone that causes calcium to be released from the bone. So calcitonin and parathyroid hormone have opposite effects on bone density. So remember that calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland, and it causes calcium to be absorbed by the bone. Then if you turn the thyroid gland around, on the backside you have the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone, which causes calcium to be released from the bones. Okay, so parathyroid hormone increases the level of blood calcium by causing calcium to be released from the bones. You can see that if you have a pituitary gland that is producing less calcitonin than if your thyroid and parathyroid glands, if they're producing equal amounts of thyroid and if they're producing equal amounts of calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, then the bone mass stays the same. If they start producing more parathyroid hormone than calcitonin, then your bones begin to weaken. If they produce more calcitonin than parathyroid hormone, your bones will strengthen. Okay, so bone remodeling, as we said, calcitonin is produced by the thyroid. It takes calcium out of the blood and puts it into the bone. Parathyroid does the opposite. And therefore, the concentration of calcium in the blood, remember that calcium is used in cells to mediate a lot of reactions. Calcium is used as a cofactor, a prosthetic group of a lot of the enzymes that mediate reactions in the cell. So you need to have a good supply of calcium floating around in the blood, made available to the cells. If the level of calcium that's dissolved in the blood goes too high, then your thyroid hormone will produce more calcitonin in order to send it to the bone and sequester it in the bone. If the level of calcium in the blood drops too low, your parathyroid hormone will start producing more. Parathyroid glands will start producing more parathyroid hormone that takes calcium out of the bone and puts it into the blood to bring the calcium concentration back up to the homeotic set point, to the amount that it's supposed to be. Okay, so that is involved. The purpose of that is the homeotic control of the amount of calcium in the blood. But the side consequence of that is bone remodeling, which is that your bones become stronger or weaker in response to the balance between the amount of calcitonin versus parathyroid hormone that you're producing. Okay, so osteoporosis. All right, so the adrenal glands. Okay, so the adrenal glands have a cortex and a medulla, which is the central part. Okay, so the cortex of the adrenal gland is stimulated by adrenocorticotropic hormone, rather, right? So remember the ACTH. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal gland cortex to release a class of steroid hormones that are called corticosteroids. And the medulla produces epinephrine, and the medulla is connected by neurons directly to the brain, and the brain controls the medulla to release epinephrine directly. So corticotropic hormones, in order for the adrenal gland cortex to release the corticotropic hormones, the pituitary gland has to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Right? Whereas in order for the medulla to release epinephrine, the brain just has to say so, and the message is instantly transmitted through nerves from the brain to the adrenal glands. So remember, we have an adrenal gland on the top of each kidney, right? And then the adrenal gland is composed of a cortex and a medulla, which are stimulated in different ways and which release different hormones. Okay, so the cortex produces something called the adrenal gland cortex produces something called long-term stress hormones, and I'll list two of those in a minute. And the adrenal gland medulla produces short-term stress hormones that are involved in the fight or flight response. So some of you that are studying psychology might have heard of the flight or fight response. The flight means to run away. Fight means to fight and defend yourself. So the fight or flight response is something that it's a bunch of changes that your body undergoes in order to make you aggressive and strong and fast. So if you're suddenly confronted by a life-threatening situation, the fight or flight response will be invoked. And usually that means turning on the adrenal gland medulla, producing short-term stress hormones, epinephrine in this case, and a related compound called norepinephrine. And those things cause blood to be diverted. Those hormones cause blood to be diverted away from the skin and into the heart, lungs, and the legs and the arms in case you have to run or fight. It also increases your respiratory rate, so you breathe faster. It increases your pulse rate, so your heart beats faster. And so that particular response, the fight or flight response that causes the adrenal gland medulla to release epinephrine, that is controlled directly from nerves from the brain. So it has to be turned on. That response has to be able to be turned on very quickly. So if you turn around the corner, if you're walking down the street and you turn around the corner and there's a lion there that looks like it's going to eat you, you have to be able to make this change to your body quickly. And it does happen quickly. In a split second, you have this fear response. Your breathing speeds up, your heart rate speeds up, the blood is diverted from one part of the body to the other, and you either have to fight the lion or run as fast as you can away from it. Okay, if you turn the corner, you see a lion, you suddenly breathe faster, you increase pulse rate, and then within a split second, you realize that that's actually a stuffed lion. It's not a real lion, so it's not a danger to you. That fear, that feeling of fear, disappears fairly quickly, right? So it's not a long-term response. It is a short-term response. It's turned on very quickly, and if there's no more need for the response, it can be turned off very quickly. It's something that's only used in the short term, so therefore it's a short-term stress hormone. The adrenal gland cortex produces long-term stress hormones in response to a stressful lifestyle that is chronic, a chronically stressful lifestyle. So you're in a long-term, unpleasant, slightly fearful situation. There are a lot of reasons why you might be in that situation. One of the situations for students where they're in a long-term stress situation is exam period. Right, so exam week, you're probably scared and stressed for the entire week leading up to exam week and for the entire week during exam week. So there's a 2-week period where you're stressed and you're worried about passing your final exams. And so those are the times when the adrenal gland cortex is producing corticosteroids in response to adrenocorticotropic hormone produced by the pituitary gland. So let's look in more detail at the hormones that are produced by the adrenal gland cortex. So there are 2 classes. So these are classes of hormones that are produced by the adrenal gland cortex. One class is called the glucocorticoids, and the other class is called the mineralocorticoids. Okay, so within these 2 classes, let's just look at one example. Within the glucocorticoids is one of the glucocorticoids is a hormone called cortisol. Okay, so generally speaking, the glucocorticoids as a class are a bunch of hormones that cause the body to break down fats to release energy, and also to suppress. They also have the effect, whether intentional or not, to suppress the immune system. So the glucocorticoids, basically, if these are long-term stress hormones, these are both of the classes of hormones that are produced by the adrenal gland cortex are long-term stress hormones, and the glucocorticoids function by breaking down fat to release energy in response to living in a stressful lifestyle. The idea being that whatever situation you're in is kind of bad and stressful, and so you'll need some extra energy over the long term in order to get out of that situation. So they tend to break down fats. These hormones, they cause the body to break down the fats and release energy. They have a side effect of suppressing the immune system. Now, if you remember, one of the things that we discussed when we were talking about the immune system was the idea that some things can be inflamed. Inflammation is when some part of the body is basically under attack by the riot police for some reason. And we said that the immune response, the inflammatory response, can be provoked by either an infection from bacteria, for example, but it can also be caused by a mechanical insult, such as being punched in the face or something like that, and then you have, or it can be caused by an allergy to an insect bite or something like that. But generally speaking, once in a while, you have some part of the body that becomes chronically inflamed, and remember that one of the 4 symptoms of inflammation is swelling. And so if you swell some tissue up in a certain area, that swollen tissue is likely to put pressure on nerves. So you remember the example of carpal tunnel syndrome? We said that there's a nerve that runs through the carpal tunnel. So the bones of the wrist are called the carpal bones. They form a sort of a tunnel shape, and through that tunnel there are tendons that control the fingers. So the muscles the carpal muscles that cause the hand to close into a fist, most of those muscles are not located within the hand itself. They're located in the forearm. Only the tendons run into the hands. Right, so you have the muscles that close the fist in the forearm, located in the forearm, where the radius and the ulna are, and then you have the tendons that run through the carpal tunnel and connect to the fingers so that the fingers will pull shut. Now, if you're putting some odd strain on the tendons within the carpal tunnel, these tendons will swell up. And if they swell up, they take up more space. They really have no place to go because they're enclosed by the carpal muscles. So the swelling ends up putting pressure on a nerve called the median nerve that runs through the center of the carpal. Okay, so what do you do if you have pain that's due to swollen tissues that are putting pressure on nerves? Well, one of the simplest things you can do is simply to reduce the swelling. And because swelling due to inflammation is part of the immune response, glucocorticoids can reduce swelling because they have the effect of suppressing the immune system. So that is one of the things that they do. Pharmaceutical companies have exploited this to make either injections or topical creams. The word topical means on the surface. So topical creams that you can rub on sore joints, for example. So if you have chronic shoulder pain, long-term permanent shoulder pain due to swelling of tissues in the shoulder that are putting pressure on one of the nerves that runs through the shoulder, you can either inject cortisol into the muscle surrounding that area to take the swelling down, or if you have carpal tunnel or arthritis in some cases, you can rub hydrocortisone cream onto the area that's swollen, and that will take the swelling down and therefore relieve the pain. So glucocorticoids are often used by doctors and medical people to reduce swelling and therefore alleviate long-term pain that's caused by swelling. The mineralocorticoids cause your kidneys to retain salt. We're not exactly sure what the purpose of that is, but it does cause, the more salt that you retain, the more water that you retain, because the salt concentration of the blood increases, and then that causes the hypothalamus to tell the posterior pituitary gland to produce more vasopressin. Okay, or antidiuretic hormone. So we're not quite sure what the purpose of the mineralocorticoids is, but if you live a stressful lifestyle and you're constantly under stress, you do tend to have higher blood pressure, and one of the reasons for that tends to be the fact that the adrenal gland cortex produces mineralocorticoids. An example of some of these mineralocorticoids is called aldosterone. Okay, so if I asked you to give me an example of give me two examples, give me two classes of hormones that are classified as long-term stress hormones. You can say the glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids. If I say give me one example of a glucocorticoid, you can say cortisol. If I say give me one example of a mineralocorticoid, you can say aldosterone. Okay, now the interesting thing is that the glucocorticoids have this odd effect of suppressing the immune system. We've exploited that to relieve swelling and then relieve constant pain in various parts of the body that are due to swelling. But one of the other things is that if you are constantly under stress, you will get sick more often. So I remember when I was a student, the first and second year classes at UBC, they would have all the final exams and all of the Christmas exams in December in a large gymnasium, which is now gone, but it was called the War Memorial Gymnasium. And there would be about 2,000 students in this gymnasium, all sitting at their individual desks. And I just remember that in the winter, in the December final exams, you would hear everybody coughing and sneezing and blowing their nose. It seemed like every other person had a cold. And that's not your imagination. That's a fact, because in reality, during the exam week, everyone is under constant stress. They're constantly studying. They're staying up until all hours. They're under stress because they're worried that they're going to fail their exams. And the more worried you are, the more glucocorticoids your adrenal gland cortex will produce, and the lower your immune system will be, and therefore the more vulnerable to catching a cold you will be. So that is one of the downsides of the glucocorticoids. One of the upsides, as I mentioned, is that they can be used to reduce swelling and the constant pain that is caused by swelling due to inflammation of various parts of the body. So hormones are often used for long-term pain management of chronic pain due to inflammation of different parts of the body. So what I've shown you here is a picture of a man with a sore shoulder. When I was growing up, one of my best friends, his father was a sawmill worker, worked in a sawmill, which is a very physically demanding job. So he was constantly pulling boards out of machines and putting strain on his shoulder. And then as he got older, his shoulder joint became inflamed and he had constant pain in his shoulder. And so every couple of weeks he had to go to the doctor and get a shot of cortisol into the shoulder to relieve the swelling so the pain would go away. So there are a lot of examples of people who have, particularly elderly people who have a long-term pain of one part of their body, and either they rub hydrocortisone cream onto that area to relieve the swelling and therefore relieve the pain, or they have a internal shots with a hypodermic needle of cortisol injections to relieve the swelling and relieve the pain. All right, let's talk about the adrenal gland medulla. As I said, the adrenal gland medulla is meant for a fast response, particularly the fight or flight response, and it is connected, the adrenal gland medulla is connected directly to the brain, and so therefore the brain is what decides when you should be scared. You see something scary, you immediately start producing epinephrine from your adrenal gland medulla. That prepares your body for fight or flight. If you suddenly decide instantaneously you decide that whatever you were scared about is not a threat anymore, the production of that hormone will stop and your body will go back to normal. So this is a short-term stress hormone. Let's move on to the pancreas. So within the pancreas we have two types of cells. One type of cell is called an acinar cell, and the acinar cells produce the digestive enzymes. Right. Then we have another type of cell. These are two types of cells called alpha and beta cells, and the alpha and beta cells produce insulin and another hormone called glucagon. Insulin is a hormone that allows glucose in the blood to enter cells, and also it causes glucose in the blood to be converted into glycogen in the muscles and the liver. And then glucagon does the opposite, so it allows glucagon causes glycogen to be converted back into glucose and put into the blood. So once again, the concentration of glucose in the blood is controlled through homeostasis. And in this case, there are two hormones, insulin and glucagon, that control the concentration of glucose in the blood. Both types of cells are present in the pancreas. So here we see that the digestive enzymes that are used to digest food are created in the acinar cells of the pancreas and delivered through this tube called the pancreatic duct and into the duodenum. The other cells, the alpha and beta cells, are located in structures that are called islets of Langerhans, and they produce the insulin and the glucagon that are put out into the bloodstream. They are endocrine glands that are put into the bloodstream that cause insulin to be put into cells or taken out of cells. Okay, so the pancreas actually has three functions. They are, number one, to produce digestive enzymes that are put into the duodenum. Number two, it produces bicarbonate, which is responsible for raising the pH of the chyme that comes out of the stomach, and raising the pH from 2 all the way up to 8, because the digestive enzymes that are produced by the pancreas have an optimum pH of 8. And they also regulate the amount of glucose that's contained in the blood a homeostatic process, through the production of either insulin or glucagon. So these are insulin and glucagon are produced by the cells of different cells of the pancreas. Okay, so insulin is responsible for conversion of glucose into glycogen, and it lowers the blood level of glucose that's present in the blood. Glucagon does the opposite. It converts glycogen back into glucose and raises the glucose level of the blood. Now, insulin, of course, if you have any, you may have relatives who have type 2 diabetes. Diabetes is where the islet cells in the pancreas have lost the ability to produce insulin. It's caused by a mutation. So in the past, people used to die in their late teens or early 20s of a terrible disease called diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is what it was called. And it was diabetes mellitus. They didn't realize it at the time, but diabetes mellitus was caused by the failure of the pancreatic cells to produce insulin. Okay, a little bit of history, again, for the art students who are interested in history and things like that. So one of Canada's national heroes was a doctor named Frederick Banting, Frederick Grant Banting, and he died in 1941. He was killed in the Second World War, but he was a famous physician who discovered how to isolate insulin from the pancreas and then use that as a treatment for diabetes. Frederick Banting discovered how to do this in 1921, and in 1923 he was given the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine, as a result of discovering insulin and figuring out a way to extract insulin from the pancreases of animals and then inject the insulin into human diabetics as a treatment for diabetes mellitus. So Frederick Banting discovered insulin in 1921, and he was given the Nobel Prize. As you know, the Nobel Prize is a prize that they give away. Norway and Sweden give it away. A committee of scientists and other people decides who gets the various prizes every year. You've heard of the Nobel Peace Prize. There is a Nobel Peace Prize. There's a Nobel Prize for Science and Medicine. I actually worked with one of the scientists who won the Nobel Prize for Science and Medicine. His name was Michael Smith, and now there's a research institute named after Michael Smith at UBC. So I feel very privileged to have worked for him when I was a graduate student. But anyway, there's only been a few Nobel Prizes for science that have been won by Canadians. And the Nobel Prize that Frederick Banting was given was Canada's first Nobel Prize. It was the first time in history that Canada was any Canadian scientist was awarded the Nobel Prize. So if we're going to be good, proper Canadians, we should know who our national heroes are. In truth, most regular Canadians don't know who Frederick Banting is, but if you know who he is now, then you'll be good Canadians. So Frederick Banting received Canada's first ever Nobel Prize for Science, and he got that Nobel Prize in 1923 for the discovery of insulin. All right, let's look at the gonads, the ovaries for women and the testes for men. Okay, so the testes in men produce a class of hormones that are called androgens. The word andros is an ancient Greek word meaning male, meaning man, masculinity. And these androgens are what they cause changes to the body. Men start to produce them when they go from when they enter puberty, when they enter adolescence, their teenage years, and their bodies develop from the body of a boy into the body of a man. And these androgens, one example of an androgen is the hormone testosterone. So the hormone testosterone, you might have heard of, it allows men to build muscle tissue more easily. It causes men to have facial hair. It also causes the hair on your head to fall out. It is true that men who have more testosterone tend to go bald more easily. They lose the hair on their head, which is one of the effects of testosterone. And it causes the development of what are called male secondary sexual characteristics. Secondary sexual characteristics, if you ever take Biology 110 or 120, you may learn that secondary sexual characteristics are characteristics that distinguish males from females, even though they actually have nothing to do with reproduction. So obviously males and females have different reproductive organs, but in addition to that, there are other characteristics that distinguish males from females, namely the body shape. So women have an hourglass figure, and men have more of a V shape and develop muscle more easily. So those physical secondary sexual characteristics are created by the androgens in males. And in women, the estrogens are a class of hormones that lead to the female secondary sexual characteristics, the kind of hourglass figure that women have, larger hips, narrower waist, and so on. Okay, so the androgens are produced by the testes in men, and by the estrogens are produced by the ovaries in women. These are both the androgens and the estrogens are steroid hormones. So they are produced by putting some extra bits and pieces here and there on cholesterol. So secondary sexual characteristics, that boys and girls, they have different sex organs, but they have basically the same body shape until they're about 10 or 11 years old, and then they enter puberty, they enter adolescence, and then they develop the characteristic female body shape versus the characteristic male body shape. So the male body shape is caused by the production of androgens by the testes. Female body shape is caused by the production of estrogens by the ovaries. Okay, now remember that the word androgen has the root word andro, and the word andros is an ancient Greek word meaning man. So andras or andro refers to maleness, macho man, maleness. Okay, so here's something that you people who are interested in culture and communications and anthropology and sociology may be interested in. Okay, so in the 1980s, a fad began. There started a fad which was called androgyny. So do you know this is a famous singer from the 1980s on the left. She's female, doesn't look very female there, but her name is Grace Jones. She's still alive. She's in her 70s. And this person on the right is David Bowie, who went through an androgynous phase where he looked a lot like it was very hard to tell whether either of these people are male or female based on their secondary sexual characteristics and the way they groom themselves and the way they dress and so on. So in the 80s, that fad, that fashion among the pop stars was called androgyny, and the word androgyny was used to refer to female pop stars that tried to look masculine and male pop stars that tried to look feminine. But in fact, that word is a misnomer, because the word, so that maybe a sociologist would call this androgyny when David Bowie is trying to look less masculine. But in fact, that's an incorrect word, because in reality, the word andro as an androgyny means male. So the word androgyny from a biological perspective, not from a sociology perspective, but from a biology perspective, the term androgyny can only refer to a female who tries to look more masculine. It's improperly used if you use it to describe a male who tries to look more feminine. So androgyny, the term is misused, at least from a scientific point of view. From a biological point of view, androgyny means to do things to become more masculine in appearance. Androgyny correctly used, androgyny incorrectly used for David Bowie. Okay, how about another example of misuse of the word andro? So what do you call a female robot? Sometimes a robot that resembles a human is the term android was coined to describe a robot that resembles a human. That's called an android. But what happens if you have a female android? Do you still call it an android? Technically, you shouldn't. From a biological point of view, from the perspective of the origins of these words, you shouldn't call a robot that looks like a woman. You shouldn't call it an android. In fact, a more correct word would be a gynodroid. Right, so a gynodroid would be the correct way to describe a robot that looks like a woman. Okay, let's see if you can name the endocrine organs. Okay, so what's up here? What is this large structure up here? Right. What's this? Right. If you said that this structure up here was the hypothalamus, you would be right. If you said that this was the pituitary gland, you would be right. Okay, what's this structure here? If you said that was the thyroid, you'd be right. And what are these behind the thyroid? Okay, if you guessed the parathyroid glands, you'd be correct. What are these? If you answered the adrenal glands, you would be right. What is this? If you answered the pancreas, you'd be correct. What is this structure here? This structure is meant to be the female uterus and the ovaries. So in this case, it's really only the ovaries that we care about. And then here, this is meant to be the testicles, and these are the testes. So these are the main endocrine organs that we've learned about. Right, so can you just make sure that you can correctly identify all of these organs? Okay, can you name any hormones that come from the posterior pituitary gland? Okay, make your guess. Okay, these are the hormones produced by the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, quickly tell me which hormones are produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and tell me which ones are tropic hormones versus non-tropic hormones. You can pause the video for a minute, and then I'll give you the answer. All right, what hormones can be produced by the thyroid gland? Pause the video, make your answer. What is the function of thyroid hormone versus calcitonin? Can you answer that question? What's produced by the parathyroid glands? What does parathyroid hormone do? Do you remember? What about the pancreas? What's the function of these two hormones? And which one does which? They have what's called antipodal effects, meaning that they do the opposite. They are antagonistic to each other. Okay, what about hormones produced by the adrenal gland cortex versus the adrenal gland medulla? Name the hormones, name the two classes of hormones produced by the adrenal gland cortex, and give me one example of each. And then name one hormone produced by the adrenal gland medulla and tell me what its function is. And then tell me which of these two hormones produced by the adrenal gland cortex or the adrenal gland medulla, which of them are controlled directly from the brain rather than by the production of a tropic hormone. Remember, norepinephrine is just a variation of epinephrine. They both do the same thing. Okay, now which one of these two is controlled by the brain? That would be the adrenal gland medulla. Production of epinephrine and norepinephrine is produced by the adrenal gland medulla. And then, which one of these how are the glucocorticoids controlled? What causes them to be released? If you answered Adrenocorticotropic Hormone, which is produced by the anterior pituitary gland, that would be the correct answer. Okay, ovaries and testes. Estrogens and progestins are two classes of hormones that are produced by the ovaries in women. The androgens, for example, testosterone is one of the androgens that's produced by the testes. Okay, let's talk about some pathologies of the endocrine system. And remember that here's a definition for you. Symptoms, when you have an illness, the symptoms are subjective characteristics of a disease. So subjective means it's something that's relative to you. It's something that you personally interpret rather than objective, which means something that you can observe. Okay, so subjective symptoms are subjective. Examples of symptoms are pain, nausea, headache, right? So how do you quantify? The word quantify means how do you assign numbers to something? Okay, so how can you measure pain? It's a subjective thing. It's something that's internal to you. And some people are more sensitive to pain than others. So pain is definitely a subjective thing. We do try to, put numbers to subjective things. Sometimes we say, pretend that on a scale of 1 to 5, how much pain are you in? Right? So if 5 is the most pain you can possibly imagine and 1 is just a mild irritation, how much pain are you in on a scale of 1 to 5? By the way, the 1 to 5 scale, when you say, you know, none or very little versus a lot scale of 1 to 5, that's called a Likert scale, and that's something that's very important to psychology. And anytime that you're trying to measure something that can't really be measured objectively with a measuring stick or something like that, you're measuring something that is subjective, you often resort to a Likert scale, and then you ask a million people, you know, when you had a toothache, how much pain were you in on a scale of 1 to 5, and then from that you can calculate that, roughly speaking, a toothache would be 2 on a Likert scale or something like that. All right, so symptoms are the subjective things. Signs, which I have not written here, but signs are objective symptoms. So that means temperature, for instance. If you get a fever, your temperature goes up. That's something that you can measure. You can measure exactly the temperature of the body, right? So that's a sign versus a symptom. All right, now the word etiology, you need to know this word as well. The word etiology means what is the cause of the disease and what is the mechanism. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through some of the pathologies of the endocrine system organs, and then I'm going to tell you the symptoms, the signs, and the etiology of each of these problems with the endocrine system. Okay, so here we're going to talk about first problems with the pancreas, then problems with the pituitary gland, and then illnesses that are caused by problems with the thyroid gland. So starting with illnesses that are caused by malfunctioning of the pancreas, we begin with the most obvious one, which is diabetes mellitus. This is the only one that we're going to learn. So the symptoms and the signs and symptoms of diabetes mellitus are that you have excessive thirst, you have rapid unexplained weight loss, and you have excessive urination. And so what's going on here is that your body is unable to properly metabolize glucose. Like normally you eat food, you get glucose. It's the glucose that's used to power your body. But because the insulin doesn't work properly, the glucose is unable to get into the cells. It stays outside of the cells in the blood, and the blood concentration of glucose goes way up after you eat a meal. So instead, because your body can't properly metabolize, it can't properly catabolize glucose. You remember from lecture number 2 or 3, I think it was, we learned the difference between anabolism and catabolism. We talked about anabolic steroids as the things that help us to build tissue. Well, catabolism, glucose catabolism, is the breakdown of glucose to make ATP for energy. Glucose catabolism is not working if you have diabetes mellitus. So your blood becomes hyperglycemic because all of the glucose that comes from all the food that you're eating remains in the blood. It can't get into the cells, it can't get into the liver or to the muscles to be converted into glycogen. So instead the body breaks down your adipose tissue. So remember I said at the early part of the course that if you don't eat for several days, your body will withdraw your first reserve supply of energy, which is the glycogen that's stored in the liver and the muscles. That's enough to last you about 1 day. After you've exhausted all of the glycogen in the liver and the muscles, then and only then does your body will your body take apart the adipose tissue and start catabolizing the triglycerides in the adipose tissue. For a normal adult, a middle-aged person who has a little bit of body fat, surprisingly, that's enough to last for 2 or 3 weeks or even a month. As long as you get sufficient amounts of water, you can live off of your fat tissues for up to a month even. So you have enough glycogen to last 1 day. That's the easiest type of energy to catabolize. You have enough adipose tissue to last for 2-3 weeks. And then once the adipose tissue is gone, you have no choice but to start taking apart proteins for energy. So when you take apart proteins for energy, you generate a waste product, which is another variation of ammonia, and they are called ketone bodies. So ketone bodies, ketones basically, are produced when you break down protein and convert the covalent bonds, the peptide bonds in the protein into energy. Okay, so as I said, the analogy is that if you run out of money because suddenly you get fired from your job, you have no new money coming in. That's the equivalent of not taking in any energy from food. Suddenly you can't get any energy from the food you're eating. So the first thing that you do is you burn the glycogen. After the glycogen is easy to convert to energy. The adipose tissue is much harder to convert to energy, and the protein is not meant to be converted to energy. It can be converted to energy in an emergency, but it's not meant to be converted to energy because you don't have any spare proteins. There are no spare proteins in the body. Every protein that we have is being used for something. So the analogy that I used, the example that I used in the beginning of the course, is that the glycogen in your liver and your muscles is sort of like your bank account, your checking account, right? So if you can't take in any new money because you lost your job, let's say money and energy are kind of the same, we're making an analogy here. So you lose your job, you can't take in any new money. The first thing you do is you take out all the money in your checking account because that money is easy to get out of your checking account. Okay, once that's all gone, then you have to go to your retirement fund and you start cannibalizing your retirement fund, which is harder to get out because you have to sign papers to get your to withdraw your retirement fund, and you have to say that you need the money, and then you lose interest and so on, right? So it's not easy to get at your retirement fund. But then once your retirement fund is exhausted, you have no choice but to sell your grandmother's jewelry. And so that's basically what happens when you start metabolizing the proteins. So in the case of diabetes mellitus, people eat, the diabetics would eat food, there would be a tremendous spike of glucose, their blood would become hyperglycemic, and they would have a rapid weight loss because all of the adipose tissue would be burned up because the glucose metabolism is not working, so we go to the backup system, which is the emergency storage of energy through in lipids in adipose tissue. And when that's gone, your body starts to burn the proteins. And so that's what happened to people who had diabetes before diabetes mellitus, specifically diabetes mellitus, before the discovery and use of insulin by Frederick Banting. Okay, so the etiology of type 1 diabetes mellitus is that the pancreas can't make insulin. You treat it with injections of insulin. Okay, so the treatment is to inject insulin after each meal, in fact. So diabetics have to inject insulin a few times a day. By the way, you should be aware that insulin is not a cure for diabetes. Insulin is a treatment. So there's a difference between a treatment and a cure. A cure means that you get rid of the disease or the illness. A treatment means that the illness is still there, but you just have a way to reduce or eliminate the symptoms and the signs of the illness. So that's a treatment versus a cure. Prevention, of course, is a different thing as well. Okay, now just one more thing we have to remember. Diabetes refers to, the word diabetes means excessive urination. So one of the reasons why diabetics are always thirsty is because they're urinating all the time and losing bodily fluids, losing water. Okay, so diabetes mellitus, the symptoms are that you have thirst, weight loss, excessive urination, and excessive urination, and also ketone bodies forming in the blood. The etiology of diabetes is that the pancreas can't make insulin. Okay, so that is a pathology of the pancreas. That's a pathology of the endocrine system where something goes wrong with the pancreas. Okay, so diabetics have to inject. They have to measure the amount of blood, the amount of glucose in their blood, and then they have to inject the correct amount of insulin in order to make the blood glucose go down, because the glucose has been put into the liver and the muscles and turned into glycogen. Okay, now there's another disease called diabetes insipidus, which is a problem with the pituitary gland. So there's the word diabetes again, but it's not diabetes mellitus, it's diabetes insipidus. Okay, so again, the symptoms of diabetes insipidus are thirst and excessive urination. But the etiology is different. The etiology, the cause of this disease, is that the posterior pituitary gland is not producing enough antidiuretic hormone. It's not producing enough vasopressin. So the treatment is you take vasopressin tablets. All right, so one of the classic examples of a question, an essay question that I sometimes ask on the final, is I say that diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus have similar names and similar symptoms, but they have different etiologies. What are the symptoms and signs and symptoms of diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus, and what is the difference in the causes, the etiology of diabetes insipidus versus diabetes mellitus? So that's a question that I sometimes ask on final exams as an essay question. Okay, so diabetes mellitus and diabetes insipidus both have the same symptoms, excessive thirst and urination. They have different causes. In the case of mellitus, diabetes mellitus, the pancreas doesn't make enough insulin. In the case of diabetes insipidus, the pancreas doesn't make enough antidiuretic hormone, enough vasopressin. Okay. Now, the pituitary gland, we have pituitary dwarfism. This is a problem caused where you have the symptoms and the signs in this case are that you have a small stature, you're very small. The etiology, the cause, is that the pituitary gland doesn't make enough growth hormone. There's a simple treatment for that. You give somebody growth hormone pills. Easily cured. Giantism is where the pituitary gland makes too much growth hormone, not easily cured. There's usually something wrong with the pancreas, not the pancreas, the pituitary gland. Something wrong with the pituitary gland which is not easily corrected. So giantism, you have very large stature and a large head, often a large square jaw, right? And there's no easy cure for that. Okay, so here we have pituitary dwarfism on the left and pituitary giantism on the right. All right, now problems with the thyroid gland. Hyperthyroidism means that the thyroid gland produces too much thyroid hormone. Hypothyroidism means that it produces too little. So let's start with hyper. Hyper means above or too much. Thyroidism. Okay, so the symptoms are that you have a high body temperature. You tend to be irritated because your high body temperature makes it difficult for you to sleep. You tend to be thin because you're never storing any of the glucose as glycogen. You're constantly burning it. So in hyperthyroidism, the etiology is that the thyroid gland is producing too much. It's producing too much thyroid hormone. The problem occasionally could also be with the pituitary gland producing too much thyroid stimulating hormone. So that it's one of those two problems. It may be a problem with the thyroid gland producing too much thyroid hormone, or it could be a problem with the pituitary gland producing too much thyroid stimulating hormone, which in turn causes the thyroid gland to produce too much thyroid hormone. There is, however, a way to tell them apart, and that's that one of the other symptoms of hyperthyroidism, in addition to having kind of bulging eyes, is that you have a swollen goiter. A structure, the goiter is a big bulge in your neck that's caused by a swollen thyroid gland. Right? So when your thyroid gland is overactive, it swells up and forms a structure that's commonly called a goiter. Okay. Now, if you have an overactive pituitary gland, then you wouldn't necessarily get the goiter. But if you have an overactive thyroid gland that's causing the problem, you definitely would get the goiter. The treatment, it's been a while since I've checked the treatment for this, but the classic treatment in the old days was simply to kill the thyroid gland with radiation and then compensate so you kill the person's thyroid gland and then you give them thyroid pills, thyroid hormone pills to take the place of the thyroid gland. Okay, so these are the symptoms of hyperthyroidism. You have a swollen and enlarged thyroid gland, which is called a goiter. You can see the goiter in the neck here, right? They tend to be thin and sweaty because they're feeling hot all the time. And then they tend to have bulging eyes because there are some capillaries behind the eyes that if your blood pressure is too high, it causes these capillaries behind the eyes to fill up and cause the eyes to be pushed forward a little bit. So you have bulging eyes, a goiter, sweaty, very thin, feeling hot all the time, having lots of energy, which is a good thing. You have lots of energy, but the high body temperature and the excess energy makes it difficult for you to sleep. And if you don't get enough sleep, you tend to be a little bit irritable. So irritability is a symptom. Okay, hypothyroidism, the opposite. You would have a low body temperature. You would have lethargy. You know what the word lethargy means? It means like that's when you don't feel like doing anything. You just want to stay on the sofa all day. Just want to stay home and watch TV on the sofa. I don't want to get out and go out and do things. That's called lethargy. You have weight gain, easy weight gain. If you're female, very long painful menstrual cycles and puffy kind of sleepy looking eyes that are puffy. The etiology is the opposite problem. You have an underactive thyroid. The treatment is very simple. You just, in this case, you do not destroy the thyroid gland, you leave it in place, but you supplement the thyroid hormone that the thyroid gland is producing. You supplement that with extra thyroid hormone in the form of pills. So the treatment is to take thyroid hormone pills. So here's a man that has this is an old early 20th century photo showing one of the earlier examples of curing hypothyroidism with one of the early cures. This is kind of gruesome to think about. What the early days, they used to take the thyroid glands from dead people, dry them out, grind them up into a powder, make the powder into pills, and then you could give them to somebody with hypothyroidism like this man. And you can see that in the picture on the right, he's lost weight, he's lost the puffy eyes, he probably has more energy. And so these were some of the early treatments for hypothyroidism. And these days we don't have to do that anymore. These days you can artificially manufacture thyroid hormone. Okay, so once again, the symptoms of hypothyroidism is easy weight gain, puffy, sleepy looking eyes, a sense of lethargy, long, painful menstruation if you're female, low body temperature, feeling cold all the time, easy gain of weight, easy gain of adipose tissue. All right, so we talked about how hormones work. We talked about the different types of hormones, steroid hormones, peptide hormones versus modified steroids, peptides, and modified amino acids. Example of steroid hormones, testosterone is one example of a steroid hormone. Peptide hormone, insulin is a good example of a peptide hormone. Example of a modified amino acid, thyroid hormone is a good example of a modified amino acid that is used to make a hormone. We talked about the way hormones are sent around the body. That gives us endocrine signaling, paracrine signaling, and autocrine signaling. One word that's not on the list here is neuroendocrine signaling, so you can add that to the list. We talked about the names and learned the names and the functions of all the important endocrine glands, starting with the Pituitary Gland, which is divided into an anterior and a posterior, as well as the fact that the anterior Pituitary Gland produces a lot of tropic hormones. Tropic hormones stimulate other endocrine glands to produce regular non-tropic hormones. We talked about all the different glands, and then we talked about some problems with the pathologies of the endocrine system. Okay, so to summarize, these are the hormones that are produced by the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. Make sure you know what they all are. Right. These are the tropic hormones. Make sure you know which of these hormones are tropic and which are non-tropic. These are the hormones that are produced by the other glands. Make sure you know what they are and what they do, including these and including these. Okay, let's try a little test. You tell me which organ is affected in each of these illnesses, each of these diseases of the endocrine system. So you tell me which organ is malfunctioning in diabetes mellitus versus diabetes insipidus versus pituitary dwarfism, giantism, hyperthyroidism, and hypothyroidism. Okay, you can stop the recording and then start it again when you want the answer. All right, here's the answer. So these are the endocrine organs that are affected. These are the hormones that are affected. So make sure you can answer that question as well. All right, now let's move on just have a little discussion. I will not actually ask you about this on the test. This is just a little area of interest for the art students. Art students are interested in science, but not so much the details of science as the implications of the science. That tends to be an art student versus science student difference, is that the science students need to know all the details of how the science and the technology is doing these things, and the art students are more interested in what are the broad implications to society and to the future. What are the implications of this science? What are the implications of this technology? So one of the interesting things about endocrinology, and endocrinologists are the scientists who study the effects of hormones on the body, and one of the areas of research, one of the interesting sort of frontline, cutting edge areas of research for endocrinology is using hormone therapy as a way of extending the human lifespan and increasing the quality of human life. Okay, so let's have a look at that. Various types of scientists are looking at ways to extend the human lifespan and make sure that we're healthier as we get older and not simply deteriorating. Okay, so today's lecture was about hormone therapy. So there are scientists who are doing research on what happens to the human body if you administer human growth hormone over your entire life. As I said, we produce our own human growth hormone mostly when we're young, and then so that's what human growth hormone is responsible for our growth when we go from being small children to large adults. And then human growth hormone continues to be produced through middle age, so that when our cells wear out, the human growth hormone stimulates new cells to divide and replace the cells that have died. So all of our organs continue to function properly. And then the production of, the pituitary gland starts to produce less and less human growth hormone as we get into our 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And that lack of production of human growth hormone is responsible for a lot of the effects of aging that you see. So there are scientists right now who have been conducting now and for the last 40 or 50 years, they've been conducting long-term experiments, where they take 100 people and they start giving them human growth. They give half of them human growth hormones, and the other half don't get human growth hormones on into middle age and then into old age. And then they see if the group that they gave the hormones to is aging better and enjoying a better lifestyle than the ones that they did not give human growth hormone to. And so you compare the two groups. One of them is called a test group, and the other group is called a control group. So the test group is the group that got the human growth hormones and is still getting the human growth hormones, and the control group is the ones that they're watching as well, but not giving hormones to. And then at the end, over the long term, you compare how well each of those two groups has aged. And then if the people who received human growth hormone aged, if they lived longer, significantly longer, and they were significantly more physically fit as they got older than the group that didn't get it, then we would all start doing that, presumably. So those experiments, long-term experiments, are going on right now. Okay, there's another branch of science that's looking into organ replacement therapy, replacing the organs as they break down with mechanical artificial organs, such as artificial hearts. Okay, so we have pacemakers, we have valve replacements, and they're still doing experiments with artificial hearts, but they're not getting much publicity anymore because the age of artificial hearts was at its prime in the early 80s, and we had some bad experiences with that, and so they said, well, let's go back to the drawing board and let's not make any more big high-profile experiments with artificial hearts until we're sure that we've got this right. Okay, so then there's another type of organ transplant, which is where you use genetically modified animals that have human organs inside them, right? So the idea being that as a human gets old, if they need a replacement heart, you know how we have these days, if somebody needs a heart transplant, you have to wait for somebody to get into a motorcycle accident where they are brain dead, their brain is irreparably damaged, but their heart still works, and then you take their heart out and you put it in somebody who needs a heart transplant. So that's kind of depressing to think that everybody who needs a heart transplant doesn't get one, because the only way you can get a replacement heart is if somebody tragically dies in a motorcycle or an automobile accident. That's very tragic and very sad. It would be less tragic if you could grow human organs inside animals and then you simply kill the animal and take the organ out. Now, obviously there are many people, myself included, who hate the idea of killing animals, but on the other hand, I feel much better about killing animals because we kill animals for food. Some of us do anyway. Some of you are vegetarians, I know, and vegans, and good, very good for you. I think that's the correct philosophy. But most of us still eat meat, and so we're killing animals for a very frivolous reason, just to satisfy our taste buds. So why not do something a little more humanitarian, where you're killing animals in order to save the lives of humans? And so for myself, I would feel very slightly guilty about killing animals for that purpose, but when you see the people if you see and get to know the people whose lives are saved by this kind of organ transplant, then you feel much better about it. Okay, so there is research going into making genetically modified animals that actually have human organs on the inside, so you can kill the animal and then you have an organ transplant, a donor organ for the human. Okay, there's another branch of scientists who are working on cells that you grow in a bottle and engineering those cells so that they will turn into a functional human organ and use that for organ transplant. There's another group of scientists who are working at extending the length of life and the quality of life through calorie restriction, through a calorie-restricted diet. About 50 years ago, somebody noticed that if they took a bunch of mice and if they took one group of laboratory mice that they do experiments on in the laboratory, they took laboratory mice or laboratory rats, they let those rats or those mice eat as much as they want every day, and then you take another group of rats and you feed them only a little bit of food every other day. They found something very interesting when they compared those two groups. They found that the rats that they fed every other day lived twice as long as the rats that they fed every day, and they were in much better health. And so they figured out that they don't know exactly why this works, but calorie restriction, drastically reducing the amount of food that we eat, does in fact make you live longer and have a healthier old age. So that's called calorie restriction. That's something that anybody can do. Anybody can do it if they're interested in living longer. You just drastically reduce the amount of food that you eat. But, you know, most of us love our food, so how likely is it that that's going to happen? How many of us are actually willing to do that? Well, the answer is not as many as you might think. You know, you say you can go from eating 3 meals a day the way you do now and enjoying your meals to eating one tiny little cupful of food every day, and you'll live twice as long. I think most people would say, I don't know, I'll wait for science to discover some other way to extend the human lifespan. I don't really feel like doing that. Okay, now finally there's a group of geneticists who are studying genetic engineering, where there is an enzyme that's produced in some cells called telomerase, the telomerase enzyme, that is able to extend the lifespan of an organism. That enzyme is not produced in every cell. It's only produced in what are called the stem cells of the human body. So telomerase is an enzyme that's produced in bone marrow stem cells, as well as eggs and sperms, haploid gamete cells, the eggs and the sperms. So if we could use genetic engineering to make human beings that produce telomerase in every cell, would they be essentially immortal? It's possible. There's a lot of caveats to this research, but this is one of the research areas that's going on. So let me just go through these things one at a time, and we can think about this and have a discussion about think about what are the implications of this type of research to the future of the human race. Okay, so again, I'm not going to ask you any questions about this on the exam. Okay, so let's take a trip to see if we can find the fountain of youth. You remember there was a mythical fountain of youth where if you drank the water of the fountain of youth, you would live forever. Maybe we can do that with science. Okay, so I said that Arnold Schwarzenegger would look like this as long as he was injecting human growth hormone. Do you want to see what he looks like now? Okay, the reason for the change is because not only did he stop using human growth hormone, but his body stopped making it. And so as soon as your body stops or cuts back or reduces the amount of human growth hormone that you produce, you basically go from this to this. Okay, well, so what if you what if you forget about being a bodybuilder? What if you're just a regular person who starts injecting yourself with a small amount of human growth hormone every day for the rest of your life? You would probably, according to the current research, you would probably lead a more healthy lifestyle. You would, as you age, you would be more fit, more physically fit as you age. So you wouldn't have to go to a nursing home. You wouldn't have to be in a wheelchair. You wouldn't have to walk with a walker. You could live the lifestyle that you enjoy for a much longer time if you supplemented your growth hormone with injections. Okay, so there is anti-aging hormone therapy is currently being researched. Artificial organs. Some of you are obviously all too young to remember this. All of you, I'm sure. But in 1982, there was a famous cardiologist named Jarvik, and he invented an artificial heart called the Jarvik 7 heart in 1982. And I was a second-year university student at the time in science, and I was very excited. The whole world was very excited about this. Basically, it's a mechanical heart that uses compressed air to push the blood around the body. They put the artificial heart into two patients who volunteered for it. Right? So two patients volunteered for it. They both lived for a couple of weeks, and they died terribly due to massive infections, because it turned out that the hoses that led from the outside of the body into the body to control the hoses that were carrying the compressed air were kind of like an easy way for the bacteria to get into the body. So they said, okay, we got a bad reputation because these two guys who volunteered to have the artificial hearts died of massive infections, and normally when you die, you know that you die because your heart stops. Okay, so how do you decide when these guys die? Well, they had to decide when they were dead by reading their brain waves, because their heart wouldn't stop. It was artificial, of course, so they had to just turn the machine off at some point. And it left everybody with a bad taste in their mouth. It left the scientific and the public, left the scientific community and the public with a bad impression. So the people who do research on mechanical organs, artificial organs, said, let's be quiet for a while. Let's just keep working quietly and not drawing any attention to this for a while, and they still are. So, you know, for the last 40 years, people have been quietly working on artificial replacement organs. They probably will make a comeback, but there are other technologies that are being developed that might be even more promising. This is what the Jarvik 7 heart looked like. So there were two chambers. One of them was meant to be the left side of the heart. The other was the right side of the heart. So one of these was carrying oxygenated blood to the body, one of these two valve chambers, and the other one was pumping the blood through the pulmonary circuit. The infection, these tubes that led from the outside of the body through two holes in the skin, got easily infected. So these people died of massive bacterial and fungal infections, and it was a very unpleasant way to die. Okay, now artificial organs. For years, we have taken the cartilage parts out of animals and transplanted them into people, for instance. Okay, now this is a famous actor named John Wayne, and one of the things, he's very controversial because a lot of people, including myself, didn't like his political views, but he was a famous actor. He was a good entertainer, usually played cowboys in cowboy movies, and when he got old, one of his heart valves failed, and so they took a heart valve out of a pig and put it into his chest, and then he said, well, those of you that thought I was a pig to begin with, now you have those suspicions confirmed, right? So it has been that's just an example of transplanting an animal heart valve into a human, which was very common until the 90s, the 80s and 90s. So we've been transplanting certain body parts from animals into humans for a long time, but the problem is that the animals have a very different proteins on the surface, and so our immune system tends to attack the donated parts that we transplant. And so if somebody gets a piece of an animal transplanted into your body, you have to take immune suppressant drugs. So you have to suppress your immune system in order to prevent your immune system from rejecting the animal part that you put in. Now, we have never put in a complete animal organ into a human, but we are now on the verge of being able to do that. Okay, so this, by the way, is an artificial ear that's being cultured with human cells in a bottle. So this is part of a branch of medicine called regenerative medicine, which is where you take cells out of the human body and you put them into a bottle, and then you attach them to some kind of a device or a shape, and then you make an organ using what are called cultured cells, human cells that are grown in a bottle. Okay, but now we are making progress where you take embryonic stem cells from humans and you transplant them into animals, and the animals will actually, you transplant them into a certain spot in another animal, and then the animal will actually grow a human organ, which can then be taken out of the animal and put into a human as a transplant organ. And they have just done an experiment, a very key experiment, about 3 years ago, where what they did was they took embryonic stem cells from a mouse. Right? Embryonic stem cells, as I mentioned to you earlier, embryonic stem cells have the ability to turn into any type of cell in the body. So they took embryonic stem cells from a mouse and they injected it into a rat, a developing rat, at exactly the spot where the pancreas would be developed. And the rat ended up growing up, developing the pancreas of a mouse. Right, so we have a rat that developed the pancreas of a mouse. You could then take the pancreas out of that rat and put it in a mouse, and the mouse's immune system would not reject it. So we can do the same thing with humans. We can take human embryonic stem cells and put them into a baboon, for instance, in the spot where a baboon heart would normally develop. And so that baboon would develop into a full-grown baboon that has a human heart, and then you could take the human heart out and transplant it into somebody who needs a heart transplant. So you don't have to wait for people to be killed in motorcycle crashes in order to save other people's lives, which is kind of a tragic situation. Okay, so that is another branch of what they call regenerative medicine. You regenerate human organs to replace human organs that have worn out. Calorie restriction. Okay, take a look at these two monkeys. The monkey on the right is slow and lazy and has arthritis and is tired all the time. The monkey on the left has a great deal of energy. The only difference between these two monkeys are identical twins. The only difference between the two was that the monkey on the left was only fed every other day. Okay, so the monkey on the right, who was allowed to eat as much as he wants, aged and deteriorated rapidly during old age. Okay, so here's the monkey on the right that was allowed to eat all at once, and it's hunched over and arthritic and lethargic and doesn't have a lot of energy. Its bones ache and so on. And the monkey on the left is hungry, but it's very energetic and very, very youthful in its actions and so on. So it turns out the same thing is true for humans. You're not allowed to do experiments on humans, of course, unless those humans are volunteers. So there is a group of scientists in North America who are voluntarily restricting their diet to see if they will live a lot longer. Okay, so this guy on the left is named Paul McLaughlin, who is the president of the Calorie Restriction Society, which is a group of people who have voluntarily chosen to eat a lot less than most people do. So here he is with his wife on the right. She's also involved in this experiment where these people are eating very little food. And if you look at them, they look like they're almost starving to death, doesn't it? It looks like they've been in some terrible prison camp where they didn't feed them. But in fact, they're doing this voluntarily. And they claim that they are much more energetic than regular people that are their age who eat as much as they want. They're much more energetic. They're much more virile. The people who do this are very enthusiastic about it. So these people eat about that much food every day, about a cupful of food, which is mostly proteins and vegetables. And they don't eat anything else. So that's severe calorie restriction. So if you are willing to eat that much every day and no more, you could live longer and be healthier into old age if you can stand being hungry all the time. And they claim that the hunger doesn't last forever. You feel hungry for a while, and then that feeling goes away as your body gets used to having a lot less food to dispose of. Okay, so that's the calorie restriction method. There is a something that goes on with chromosomes. The end of a chromosome is called a telomere. It turns out that every time a cell divides, the telomeres on the ends of the chromosomes get shorter, and then eventually the cell dies when the telomeres become too short. And that's why cells wear out, because the telomeres have gotten too short. And there is an enzyme called telomerase. That enzyme is not active in regular cells. It's only active in the bone marrow cells and the gonads, the sperms and the eggs. And the reason why that makes sense is because the bone marrow cells have to be able to divide an unlimited number of times, and so do the sperms and the eggs. Right, other cells in the body, the regular somatic cells of the body, as they're called, the somatic cells have a limited number of divisions. They have a finite number of divisions that they can go through before they won't divide anymore. And then once all the cells in your body have gone through the maximum number of divisions and they can't divide anymore, that is when your body starts to wear out. So one way to prevent that from happening would be to make sure that the telomerase enzyme is active in every cell, not just the bone marrow stem cells and the germline cells. So that is what they're doing. They're doing experimenting on this because it is possible. Every cell has the gene for telomerase. The gene just happens to be turned off in most of the cells. So they're doing research now into finding out why the telomerase gene is turned on in bone marrow cells and in reproductive cells and not in the other cells. And is there some way to turn on the gene for telomerase in all the cells? Because then theoretically we could all live forever. So that's another thing. All right, so these are the different methods that science is using to try and extend the human lifespan. You should think about that because these things will become more important to you during your life. You know, I'm old enough now that it's not going to affect me much. It's not going to have too much of an influence on my life, but it may very well have a big influence on yours. So how do we extend life? One of the methods that we discussed is with anti-aging hormone therapy, specifically injecting human growth hormone to extend the human lifespan and, more importantly, to make you healthier as you age. All right, so that's it for the endocrine system. The next lecture will be about the nervous system, and then after that, it's final exam week. And during final exam week, of course, your adrenal gland cortexes will be producing lots of glucocorticoids because you'll be under stress from exams. So don't let it, try to stay away from sick people. Don't let yourself get sick because remember that your immune system will be suppressed. Okay, I'll see you at that lecture.